So today's session is about hypophysis, structure and function, and the portal hypophyseal portal system. Okay. Now let's talk about some general info of what we need to know about the hypophysis. Another name for hypophysis is the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland, basically its location is at the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, and it has two lobes. It has the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Another name for the anterior lobe is basically the adenohypophysis, and for posterior lobe is neurohypophysis, and their embryonic origin is different. For the anterior pituitary gland, we will have the ectodermal origin, and otherwise known as the Reckitt's pouch, and it's basically going to be staining darker than the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary embryonic origin, it's coming from the neuroectodermal origin. Okay? And both of them are connected through the infundibular sac. Now, this is the infundibular sac, if you can see my mouse, and the infundibular sac is part of the infundibulum, and infundibulum is what's connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Okay? Now, next thing we need to see is the two systems, the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract and the venous portal system. Good. This is a general info you guys need to see. This is the hypothalamus on top. We will have the infundibulum. We will have the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Now, let's see where we can get there. The vascular portal system of the veins, or the venous portal system, is usually related to the hormones for anterior pituitary. And basically, they're a bundle of axons which are carrying the hormones from the hypothalamus all the way to the anterior pituitary. And if we are talking about its arterial supply, it will have the main arterial supply, which is going to be superior hypophyseal artery, starting from the infundibular area and then giving branches all the way to the primary plexus. Now, secondary plexus. The primary plexus is being formed by the superior hypophyseal artery around the infundibular area, and the secondary is being formed by a continuation of the superior hypophyseal artery and the hypophyseal vein in that area, and it's mostly formed on the or around the anterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary will have its own arterial supply as well, but it's getting it from the inferior hypophyseal artery, and the plexus is being formed in that area. And obviously, hypophyseal veins will be there too. And the pathway for posterior pituitary, again, it's a bundle of axon, and it's called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Okay? Now, let's go talk about the cells that we can find on the anterior pituitary. As I mentioned, the anterior pituitary, other name for it will be adenohypophysis, and it has three parts. It has the most important parts, which is about 70% of all its lobes, which will be pars distalis. And then we will have pars tuberalis and pars intermedia. Pars intermedia, its main function is to separate the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. A better illustration will be on this picture, guys. We can see the pars intermedia here. You can see pars distalis, and then you can see the pars tuberalis, which is circling around the infundibulum. Okay? Now, yeah, here. Okay. So now, pars distalis. The pars distalis, basically, it has chromophobes and chromophils. Chromophobes means cells that do not get stained either acidophilic or basophilic, and they're usually not quite active in that area. While the chromophils are very active, they're about 75% of the pars distalis, and they also get divided into acidophilic and basophilic cells. Now, the acidophilic cells are usually only two types of cells, while the rest of them are basophilic. Okay, but these two cells, they have the majority of the cells being about 50%, of that 75% of chromophiles, while the most of the other hormones that is being produced are by the 25% cells that is getting remained. And I already talked about the pars tuberalis, what it is. You guys need to know that one of the important cells that the anterior pituitary has is called the gonadotropes, and they are mostly present on pars tuberalis. Okay? Now, the epithelium for this area is called the trabecular epithelium. I believe you guys already know what trabecular epithelium is, so this is another example of areas you can find it. It's very important to remember that they are surrounded and supported by reticular fibers. And the capsule for this area, like any other capsule in our body, it's dense connective tissue. It's coming from or surrounded by the pia mater, and the septa basically goes all the way through this capsule and gets to the anterior pituitary. As you guys can see a picture of the slides, you will see under microscope here, you can see that the basophilic are quite more darker compared to the acidophilic in this area. And you can see the chromophobes as well. Okay? Now, next cells we need to talk about. Oh, yeah, I need to name these cells from the chromophiles area as well. So the chromophobes I already talked about. There is no secretion and almost they are inactive. Chromophils, basophils, and acidophils. Acidophils, as we mentioned, are 50% of the anterior pituitary, and the two cells are mammotrophic cells, they are producing prolactin, and somatotrophic cells, which they are producing growth hormones. The rest 25% that remains are producing quite a lot of other hormones as well. The hormones going to be, the cells are going to be the thyrotropic cells, which producing TSH, the gonadotrophic cells, which is producing the FSH and the LH. By the way, this is the gonadotrophic cells that I mentioned, which is mostly found on the pars tuberalis of the anterior pituitary, which is around the infundibulum. Now, the two other cells, the corticotrophic cells and the melanotrophic cells, these two are quite similar, and therefore the hormone that comes from the hypothalamus to activate the corticotrophic cells, it also activates the melanotrophic cells as well. So both ACTH and MSH gets produced at the same time. And yeah, because these are basophilic cells, therefore they're easily stained by Pass staining, so they're Pass positive. And that's all the cells you need to know for anterior pituitary. Let's go to the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary will have two parts, and the two parts will be pars nervosa and the infundibular stalk. Infundibular stalk is in the infundibular area as well. It's just a passage area. It doesn't produce anything. And the posterior pituitary doesn't produce anything. There is no secretion by it, okay? There's no production of hormone, sorry. There's no production of hormone by it. However, it does have two important cells. It has Herring bodies and it has neurogalial cells or pituocytes. Now, this pituocytes, they're supporting cells for the neuron tissue in that area. And the Herring bodies are, I would say, they're the main cells in that area because they receive the hormones from the hypothalamus and they store them until we need them, and then they will release them to our system. Okay? So these two, or we can say three cells, are the important one we can find in neurophysis or posterior pituitary. Now, let's go in try to remember all of these in a summary version, which is this. If you guys can remember this, you should be fine almost till the end of the year. So, what is this? It's a summary of what we can find for hormones on the anterior and posterior pituitary. The hormones basically starts first to be produced by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces quite a lot of hormones, and it sends it to the anterior pituitary through the hypophyseal portal system. And in the anterior pituitary, we will have the two cells that are producing acidophilic cells and acidophilic hormones, while the rest is basophilic. Now, these two acidophilics are prolactin and growth hormones. Now, let's go through these diagram as well. From the hypothalamus, we will have the PRH, otherwise known as prolactin releasing hormone, and the PIH, which is prolactin inhibiting hormone. So the PRH causes the production of prolactin on the anterior pituitary, and the PIH inhibits it. Another name that can be referred into for the PIH in our exams will be dopamine. Okay? And so the prolactin goes to the breasts and cause lactation and milk production. Good? Now, the TRH is otherwise known as the thyroid releasing hormone. Now, the thyroid releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary, causes the TSH to be formed, the thyroid stimulating hormone, and that goes to the thyroid gland and causes the production of thyroid hormones. Now, although there is no inhibitory hormones in here to inhibit the production of TSH, but there is something called the negative feedback, which when there is an increased level of the TH or thyroid hormone, it sends a negative feedback to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and inhibit the production of them, so decreasing the level of thyroid hormone. Okay? Now, also we have the same scenario, same almost negative feedback for this sort of pathway as well, which from the hypothalamus, the CRH or the cortisol releasing hormone gets produced, goes to the anterior pituitary, causes the cell to produce the ACTH, and because the cell is quite similar to the cell that is producing the MSH, both of them get produced at the same time. The ACTH, it goes to the adrenal cortex, cortisol gets produced, and MSH goes to our skin and to the melanocytes and cause melanin to be produced. Now, the GRH and the GIH. Again, same scenario as PRH and PIH. One, the R is the growth hormone releasing hormone, and the other one is the growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Another name for it will be somatostatin. Okay? So they will go to the anterior pituitary, causes either the stimulates or inhibits the production of growth hormones. Growth hormones go to our liver or cell bodies, and they cause the cells to proliferate and divide and more cells to be produced. Okay? Now, we have another somatostatin in our body as well, guys, and that's produced in our pancreas. However, these two somatostatin, although the name is similar, they're not the same hormone. Okay? So the one that's producing in the hypothalamus will not go all the way to our pancreas to inhibit the cells there. The pancreas itself produces the somatostatin for inhibition of the hormones that is being produced in that area. But this somatostatin is only going to the anterior pituitary, or somatostatin or GHIH. Now, the last thing is GnRH, which is the gonadal releasing hormone, and the gonadal releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary, causes the FSH and LH to be formed. As I mentioned, the gonadotrophic cells are close to the or in the pars infundibula, so they are around the infundibular area and not in the distal pars distalis of anterior pituitary. These two go to the gonads, and in males, they cause androgen to be produced, and in females, it causes the estrogen and progesterone to be produced. So all these were everything you need to know besides the histological look of that area for the anterior pituitary. Now, for posterior pituitary, there's two hormones, as I mentioned, that is produced by the hypothalamus, and they go through a sets of neurons, through their axons, and go to the posterior pituitary to get stored in the herring bodies. Now, these two hormones are ADH and oxytocin. The ADH, it gets produced from the supraoptic nuclei, and the oxytocin gets produced by the paraventricular nuclei. The oxytocin goes through that a special type of neuron and axon, which is called the neurophysin type 1, and goes to the herring bodies and the posterior pituitary. And the ADH goes through the neurophysin type 2 to go to the herring bodies. When the body needs it, the herring bodies will release either of them to our system so they can act. Now, function of the ADH is basically going to our kidneys, to our distal convoluted tubules, and cause the sort of increased permeability to the water for that area. Therefore, this hormone will sort of cause the water reabsorption, and it will regulate our thirst and blood level in our body, or water level in our body. The oxytocin, on the other hand, it will go either to our mammillary gland or the uterus of females, and mammillary glands of females as well. And they will cause contraction during labor and also during milk production and milk ejection. They send the signal to the smooth muscles in the mammillary gland to allow for the milk to be ejected and contract for the milk to be ejected. And according to some scientists, it's not proven yet, but they do believe that oxytocin helps for our social binding as well. It's something interesting to know. Now, let's go to the slides. There's two slides we need to cover. Both of them are E1, but I put two different view of them. So this one, for pituitary gland, we can see the pars distalis, which is part of the anterior pituitary. We can see the basophilic cells in that area and the acidophilics or less thin cells. And then we can see the pars nervosa. Now, the pars nervosa is the posterior pituitary, as we can see here as well. And just so you guys don't get confused, we do have some colloid follicles in the pars intermedia, which is pretty similar to the one we can find in the thyroid, but they are not doing anything. They're basically an embryonic remnant for that area. Now, the neurohypophysis or posterior pituitary gland, important thing for this slide is for you guys to differentiate between the herring bodies here, between the petiocytes, which are supporting cells, and between the capillaries, which we can find in that area. Remember, the capillaries will, for both of them, anterior and posterior, will be fenestrated capillaries. Okay? And that will be the end of our lesson. Thanks for listening, and see you guys soon.